Good morning, this is Environmental Intelligence Episode 2 for February 27th, 2026, your daily briefing on environmental regulatory, science, and compliance developments that matter for Canadian professionals. Port of Churchill expansion push triggers federal IAA assessments for Manitoba Arctic infrastructure, with oil spill risks under Fisheries Act. Expansion proposals for Manitoba's Port of Churchill under federal IAA could mandate enhanced environmental assessments for pipeline and rail projects on permafrost, altering compliance for northern contaminated sites consultants. New nature studies highlight climate overshoot implications and Antarctic melt channelization, requiring updates to sea level rise projections in BC and Atlantic provincial risk assessments. Professionals should monitor federal IAA consultation deadlines and review adaptation strategies for Q1 2026 projects this week. Let's dive into the lead story. Proposals to expand the Port of Churchill in Manitoba, Canada's only deepwater Arctic port, involve potential pipeline and rail developments on tundra, raising federal oversight under the Impact Assessment Act and Fisheries Act for oil spill risks. Previously, port operations were limited by seasonal ice, with environmental reviews under Manitoba's Environment Act and federal CPA for contaminant releases. The push now includes major infrastructure upgrades that could trigger full IAA processes for projects exceeding 50 kilometers of new rail or pipeline. These changes introduce stricter habitat protection requirements under the Species at Risk Act for species like beluga whales in Hudson Bay. For practitioners, this means northern Manitoba site assessments must incorporate permafrost thaw modeling and spill response planning in Phase 1 ESAs, potentially delaying remediation timelines by 12 months. What I find interesting here is how this signals a broader federal push into Arctic infrastructure where previously provincial acts like Manitoba's Environment Act handled most reviews. In practice, this means consultants working on contaminated sites near the port will need to layer in IAA scoping early, especially for hydrocarbon baselines. Watch for federal IAA registry updates on project notices, with public consultations likely opening in Q2 2026. Provincial coordination with Nunavut under interjurisdictional agreements may impose additional EPEA equivalent standards for cross-border impacts. If you're involved in northern remediation, this could add layers to your compliance stack. Think integrating SARA protections into spill modeling, which might push costs up if you're not already factoring in extended field seasons. Shifting to regulatory and policy watch. First up, a nature climate change analysis details trade-offs in regulating property insurance to reflect disaster risks, shifting from uniform pricing to property-specific rates that could increase premiums by 20–50% in high-risk zones. For Canadian compliance, this aligns with federal climate adaptation under the Pan-Canadian Framework, affecting flood-prone sites in Ontario under the EPA and wildfire areas in BC under the CSR, where consultants must integrate insurance data into risk assessments. One concrete implication: update client advisories on adaptation costs by March 31, 2026, to align with provincial building code amendments. This ties into what we've seen in BC's recent CSR tweaks for risk modeling. It's not revolutionary, but it does mean recalibrating your Phase 2 reports to include these premium shifts as economic risk factors. Next, a nature climate change review quantifies temperature overshoot scenarios, projecting 0.1 down 0.3 DGC temporary exceedance of 1.5 degrees C targets, with socioeconomic impacts including amplified adaptation costs under Canada's Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. This updates federal CPA climate provisions and provincial frameworks like Alberta EPEA, requiring revised GHG inventories for mining and oil sands operations. Deadline: incorporate overshoot modeling into 2026 annual compliance reports due April 15th federally. What this signals is a nudge toward more conservative emissions planning. If you're in Alberta, this could mean tweaking your EPA submissions to account for these overshoot buffers, potentially avoiding compliance headaches down the line. On the science and technical front, a nature climate change study maps reveal basal melt rates in Antarctic ice shelves up to 50% higher in narrow channels, accelerating projections by 10 down 20 centimeters for global sea level rise by 2100. For Canadian practitioners, this refines flood risk mapping under CCME guidelines and BCCSR Protocol 13, impacting coastal site remediation designs in BC and Nova Scotia with tighter elevation thresholds for permeable reactive barriers. Reference updated CCME sea level data in Q1 2026 assessments to adjust monitored natural attenuation timelines. This confirms what many coastal engineers have suspected. Those extra centimeters could force redesigns in low-lying sites, so factor it into your next risk model run. Separately, research from Inside Climate News links warming oceans to 15–20% decline in southern right whale calf production, with krill shortages from climate shifts. In Canada, this informs SARA risk assessments for analogous marine mammals like North Atlantic right whales in federal waters, affecting Fisheries Act compliance for offshore projects in Atlantic provinces with enhanced monitoring protocols, apply to habitat modeling in environmental impact statements, aligning with CCME aquatic guidelines for temperature thresholds. It's worth watching because it could tighten thresholds in your next Atlantic ESA, especially if you're dealing with offshore wind or pipeline decommissioning. For industry and practice developments, advocates are seeking Port of Churchill expansion amid ice-free season extensions, but risks include tundra rail instability and oil spill remediation challenges on permafrost, according to the Narwhal. For remediation engineers in Manitoba and federal northern projects, this necessitates ISO 17025 accredited soil sampling for hydrocarbon baselines, with in situ chemical oxidation costs rising 15–25% due to access constraints. Update project bids to factor 8-month ice-limited field seasons and federal IAA scoping. This is routine for Arctic work, but the expansion push means more projects will hit these hurdles. If you're bidding on Manitoba sites, pad your timelines accordingly to avoid underestimating those permafrost variables. What I find understatedly amusing is how ice-free sounds like a bonus until you realize it just extends the window for dealing with unstable ground. In any case, this could shift market dynamics for northern consultants, with more demand for specialized SVE or bioremediation tech adapted to cold climates. Now, action items. If you're working on Manitoba pipeline-related contaminated sites projects, review federal IAA guidelines to assess implications. If you're handling BC CSR or Ontario EPA risk assessments, update sea level rise projections using new Antarctic melt data from nature. For Alberta EPA and federal CPA reporting, incorporate climate overshoot scenarios into GHG compliance models. Brief clients on risk-based insurance shifts affecting adaptation planning for flood and wildfire sites in multiple provinces. And if you're in Atlantic offshore assessments, monitor SARA updates for marine species risks based on whale calf decline findings. Looking at the week ahead, mark your calendar for February 28, 2026. Federal Canada Gazette Part 1 comment period closes on proposed CEPA amendments for PFS thresholds. March 1, 2026, Alberta EPA annual compliance reporting deadline for oil sands operations. March 5, 2026, BC CSR Protocol 1 consultation webinar on groundwater monitoring updates. March 7, 2026, CCME Guidelines Review Cycle opens for interprovincial harmonization on soil vapor extraction standards. Tomorrow, watch for updates on the CPA PFAS amendments as the comment period wraps, with potential implications for contaminated sites thresholds across jurisdictions. That's environmental intelligence for February 27, 2026. If this briefing is useful to your practice, share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive day.